This program features Sartaz Ahmed, Larry Burns, Joan Krevlin, and Tom Stewart. Speaking on Sustainable Societies, sponsored by Hewlett-Packard and Booz & Company.
I'm Devin Stewart from the Carnegie Council. Welcome. It's great to see such a fantastic, high-quality audience, as well as an extraordinary panel. Just a really great energy up in the pre-lunch. It was really wonderful to have these three speakers, and Tom Stewart, who is Chief Marketing Officer from Booz & Company. He's a maestro at moderating, and it's a great honor to turn it over to Tom to steer the program today. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you. I will begin with the usual disclaimer. I've done a couple of other these things for the Carnegie Council, and Devin and I are, if we are cousins by parents who, or by parents and grandparents and great-grandparents who appear not to have known one another. So you know, who knows what might have happened in the borderlands of Scotland way back when, but it's merely a coincidence. It's not, however, a coincidence. That was a pretty good segue. It's not, however, a coincidence that we are here at the Carnegie Council, whose basis, whose raison d'etre is ethics in international affairs. It's not coincidental that we're talking about sustainability in the context of ethics. Because if you start thinking about it, if you start pushing people, if you start talking to people about issues of sustainability, or about issues of ethics, the issue of sustainability almost inevitably arises. It's in the absence of sustainability, it's when sustainability is threatened that it becomes harder and harder to behave in an ethical manner. There was a book published a couple of years ago, and I've forgotten the name of the author, a Harvard professor, called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth. And it's quite simple. Economic growth produces moral consequences that are for the good. And that when economic growth is not there, when it's sauve qui peut, when we don't feel that sense of sustainability, that's when we start acting according to our basest and often most destructive instincts. If you then think about sustainability and start pushing the question of sustainability and think about sustainability from a corporate point of view, sustainability from a societal point of view, you very quickly come to the question of cities. Because cities are where it is at. Cities are, as Sartaz will tell you in a minute, where we are at as a human species more and more. And the epicenter, the battle for a sustainable society will be won and lost in the cities now, and the cities now existing and coming into existence in the world. And if you think about cities, you have to think about the whole system of a city, which we'll try to talk about, but among other things, you have to think about two particular parts, which is getting into and moving around in cities. Mobility, sustainable mobility is one thing. And the other issue is buildings and the actual construction, the physical, the built environment of a city. I'd like to ask the audience a quick question here. I would like to ask you, in thinking about how you came here today, and I don't mean once you were inside New York City, if you came by plane into the city or whatever it is, that's another question. But once you were inside the city, even though it's a rather misty, raw autumn day, how many of you walked to today's lunch? That looks like about 6. How many took a bike? How many rode a bike? How many took a subway or bus? A substantial number. How many of you took a taxi or a car? Actually, about the same number as walked. And I think what's interesting here is we actually had a bell curve. We had about 6 or 8 walked. The majority took some sort of public transportation. Nobody took a bicycle. Nobody came by pogo stick, I'm assuming. And then a sort of equal number came by car. I dare say that if we were having this meeting in Houston, we would have raised our hands quite differently. And that almost everybody would have said they came by car. And I also dare say that if we were having this meeting in Amsterdam, we would have raised our hands differently, and a great many, probably the majority of us, would have come by bike. The point that I'm trying to make is that issues of mobility are issues of choice, that they vary, that pretty cool cities like Amsterdam can make very different choices from pretty cool cities. Let's make another city where people might have come by car, Los Angeles, because Houston's not exactly cool. Sorry, Houston. But you can live in a city that has an urban kind of cool feeling and have very different choices about transportation. I'd also like to ask a quick question about buildings. How many of you people live in a building, I don't care whether it's an apartment, residential home, your own home, whatever it is, where there has been a substantial investment in energy efficiency? I don't mean fluorescent light bulbs. I mean some sort of substantial investment either in the way it was originally built or something you have done or your landlord has done. 1, 2, 3. How many people, and the rest of you, I think, is sort of residence as usual, right? I mean, compact fluorescent bulbs, maybe a little double glazed windows here and there. How many of you in your office buildings work in an office building that is a LEED certified office building, or is in some way substantially more energy, is an office building of, how many of you people live in the office building of the future today? 1. So we have a long way to go, and we have a lot of opportunities. What I want to do is we're going to turn this over to the panel. I'm going to introduce them one at a time. Each of them is going to talk for 10, 15 minutes, teeing up a couple of the big issues about cities, about mobility, about built environment. We'll talk a little bit among ourselves. We'll turn it over to you and get as many questions as we possibly can from you before wrapping up, and we'll have a hard stop at 2 o'clock. Immediately to my right is my colleague Sartaz Ahmed. Sartaz is a principal at Booz & Company. She works in the energy business with clients in the energy and infrastructure sectors, critical issues relating to energy, carbon, and sustainability. She has participated in writing quite a number of articles for us, white papers and viewpoints and articles on the topic, and has studied it very thoroughly. And she's going to talk a little bit, lead us off with a little bit of the story of urbanization and some of the particular sustainability challenges that it presents. So Sartaz, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, everyone. Happy to be here. I work in the energy sector and basically look at both the supply side and the demand side. On the supply side, I look at even the dirtiest of the dirty, coal, which is sort of essential for providing us with energy today, but I also look at renewables, everything from solar to wind. And on the demand side, the focus is on trying to understand how we use energy, are there ways of using energy more efficiently, and understanding the impact on the environment. And the way this study came about is we started by looking at technology and trying to understand, could we use technology to reduce the way we use energy and therefore lower our carbon footprint? That took us to the question of demand. Where is demand growth? And as we all know, it's linked to population growth and economic growth, as Tom said. And in terms of population growth, of course, all eyes turn to the developing world. We always hear the numbers, the billion people in China, the billion people in India, and the rest of the developing world. What was curious is when we started looking at the population growth about where these people were going to live. Today, 50% of the world's population live in urban areas, and in 2050, we expect that 75% of the people will be living in urban areas. Why do we care about urban areas? Provides opportunity for economic growth, amongst other things. There are obviously cool things to do, maybe not in Houston, but there are other cool cities in the world where there are cool things to do. And beyond that, it's about economic growth. And with economic growth comes more consumption, and at times much more energy consumption as well. We want bigger homes, we like buying more gizmos, we all want our iPads and our iPhones and different things. Today, urban areas account for about 70% of the energy consumption of a region. And yes, we can make different choices of how we power our cities. In France, they rely mainly on nuclear power. 70% of the electricity is from nuclear power, so the carbon footprint is very different. But in the US today, 50% is from coal. Slightly dirtier, and China, it's about 70 to 80% is from coal, so significantly dirtier. And unless you find cleaner options, that's going to continue in the near future. So as with everything else, cities also tend to evolve. Today, when we think about the developing world, we think about Beijing, we think about Mumbai, we think all these people are going to go and live in these cities. But what we found is that people are moving to the so-called second-tier cities, third-tier cities, and even fourth-tier cities, not the cities which have population of 10 million, but population of maybe less than 5 million, and most of the growth is expected in cities of less than 500,000. According to our estimates, again, this is sort of predicting things 30 years out, so I may be a bit off, but we expect that there'll be about 3,000 new cities. And the emissions profile or the energy use of a city is determined very much by how the infrastructure is developed early on in a city's life. And that sort of carries on to the growth phase. And then eventually when it's a mature city, the energy profile is set by what? The investment choices that were made very early on. So given that there are all these new cities that are going to come into being, we have a tremendous opportunity to make the difference right now, given what we know about climate change and the possible impact that it could have on the future. Again, based on our estimates, we found that we could be spending about $350 trillion over the next 30 years in infrastructure. We took a slightly narrow focus. We just looked at buildings, residential and commercial, and mobility. How do you move goods and people? We didn't really look at waste and water and other industries that could be situated in cities. So it was a slightly narrow focus, but nonetheless, there's a tremendous amount of money that's going to be invested in all these new cities over the next 30 years, which provides us with an opportunity to do things differently. What really matters when you're thinking about doing things differently and shaping the profile of a city? Policy obviously has a huge impact, technology, as well as the financing. How do you finance this new thing? So we were talking about LED lighting. It can have a huge impact, but right now it's not quite there. It hasn't come into solution. And the thing about technology is we believe that it comes into solution when it's close to being competitive and you have some sort of a subsidy or a policy push to just tip it over the barrier. But there are different ways of providing this sort of subsidy. It could be something like the stimulus package we saw now, or it could be something much larger, as Tom and Larry were talking about. It's about, say, setting up the highway system that supported the development of the automobile industry. So we possibly need to rethink how we think about policy. A couple of examples of how technology and policy are coming into play and how we could do things differently in the future. There's a city called Dezhou, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, in China. It's called the Solar City. They're trying to harness the solar energy for everything, from electricity to water heating to moving people, carts. There are about 100 solar enterprises, so it not only does it lower the footprint of the city, but it also provides economic growth. There's another city called Baoding called the Green Electric Valley, similar to the Silicon Valley. 200 new companies providing manufacturing, wind turbines, other new energy technologies, supplying not only the demand in China, but also the rest of the world. Again, it's sort of lowering the emissions profile of a city, but also providing economic growth. And then the other example, which most of you may have heard about, is Masdar, the ultimate in urban greenfield. This is a city in Abu Dhabi. The aim is to have zero impact on the environment, and the aim is to have about over 1,000 new companies. It's very much in the R&D phase. It's about innovating and finding solutions for the future. But the common theme in these three cities is obviously there is a lot of effort. There's a policy. There's a government policy supporting it. They're trying new technologies, and then there's a financing from the government. So these are the new cities. What can we do about the existing cities? It's obviously a lot harder, as we all know, as we grow older, to change. It's the same thing with cities. Once we're set in our ways, it's difficult to change. But a couple of examples, again, that come to mind. There's a city called Freiburg in Germany, and they have decided that they are going to go on the sustainable path. They have changed their building codes. They're focusing on energy efficiency. They're focusing on renewable energy, and also on mass transit and providing bikes. But the ultimate goal is to make the city livable. It's not to take away from this, but it's to achieve the dual goal of sustainability and livability. So that's Freiburg. And then there's the example of Malmö, which was a shipbuilding city in Sweden. It used to be called Dirty Old Malmö. And however, in 1994, they decided they needed to do something differently. And once again, the focus was about making it a better place to live in, not just sort of being sustainable and green. And again, similar sort of options around residences, about reducing your energy consumptions, doing things more smartly, and that sort of taking care of the built environment, and in terms of movement, providing options where you don't have to rely on the internal combustion engine and gasoline, but possibly bikes and possibly on renewable fuels. And then in the US, we have the example of Portland. And against this two-pronged approach of looking at reducing the energy consumption in buildings and providing people options on how to move about without relying on gasoline to the extent that we do. So in summary, there's a challenge out there. There's tremendous amount of population growth. We expect that this decade will be about urbanization. So how do you solve this challenge or meet this challenge? Obviously, policy, technology, and financing will play a role. However, these are not sufficient in themselves. It has to be about not only addressing sustainability, but also the livability and also providing economic opportunity.
So my math is, I'm a math-challenged individual. But I think I heard you say that, I know I heard you say, and I think my math is right. Right now, half of humankind lives in cities, and 70% of energy is consumed in cities, right? Mm-hmm. Which means that an urban dweller is roughly 40% more energy consuming mm-hmm. than somebody actually it's more than that, because than somebody who's living in the country, right? So as more of us move to the cities, we will become energy hogs if we move to cities that are like the cities we are building today. Yes. And so if you move to a human population that is 75% urban, and the urban citizen of tomorrow is as energy consuming as the urban citizen of today,
yes,
we are literally cooked. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So
unless we're using nuclear energy and renewable energy.
Okay. All right. Unless we can absolutely swap in, right?
Yes.
And we could radically change the energy mix.
Yes.
Or we can radically change the energy consumption, or some combination of the two. We've got to do something different if we're going to
It'll have to
live
be a
in an
suite
urban
of solutions.
district. Right. But business as usual will not
hot, possibly.
Will be hot. Yes. Right. Let me turn next to Larry Burns, who's sitting in the middle of the table. Larry is currently an engineering professor at the University of Michigan, director of the Roundtable on Sustainable Mobility at the Earth Institute of Columbia. He's the former VP of R&D at General Motors. He's been a major voice for the reinvention of the automobile. It was Larry who presented the Volt to the GM board a few years ago. And Larry, I'd like to turn it to you to talk a little bit about the issues of getting around in cities. And I guess when we talk about getting around in cities, we're talking not just about people moving, but also about goods and services and so on and so forth. So as soon as I think we have to solve a slight video problem on the PowerPoint. But while we're doing that, while we're solving that, the other thing I wanted to point out that Sartaz pointed out is that the other number that she pointed out, that she mentioned, was $350 trillion for infrastructure alone, and that was infrastructure in terms of the built environment and transportation, but it wasn't infrastructure like garbage collection and so on and so forth. $350 trillion sounds like, as Everett Dirksen said, if you add it up, pretty soon you're talking about real money. And so this doesn't sound just like a challenge. Yeah, give or take a few trillion. Now, even if it's only $39 trillion, it sounds to me like that there's an opportunity here. This is a fig tree under which one would want to have one's apron so that you could catch the windfall that might come out of it. Larry.
Okay. Thank you very much. If we could go ahead and play the video.
Plays over there.
Oh, it's right over here. Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Those of you over there.
I just returned from 8 days in Shanghai, and I want to kick off my presentation with a short clip on one of the exhibits at the Shanghai World Expo. It's one I had involvement in while I was still at General Motors. It's the GM Shanghai Automotive Pavilion. And we were asked to create a vision for a better city, better life in the year 2030. And I think the video clip gives you a sense of what's going on. I should add, while I was in Shanghai, they were averaging about 600,000 visitors a day to the World Expo, with people visiting willing to stand in line 4 to 5 hours to see some of the things going on in the pavilion. And then I'll put what you see here in context in a minute. Oops, excuse me, let me go back one time.
20年后的2030年，智能的城市道路系统以及人性化的汽车将彻底颠覆今天的出行概念。在2010年世博会上汽集团通用汽车馆，我们会改变您对未来城市交通的看法。您可以领略到未来汽车的外观，看到未来汽车如何驾驶甚至思考，并了解汽车将如何积极改变我们的生活。借助电气化、车联网和自动驾驶的先进科技方案，未来驾驶将实现零油耗、零排放、零堵塞和零事故，而未来的驾驶体验也将变得前所未有的时尚且充满乐趣。
The vehicle concept that you were looking at is called ENV, for electrically networked vehicles. And as we thought about a better city and better life in Shanghai in particular, we were struck by a simple calculation. If we extrapolated the number of cars that would be in Shanghai in the year 2025, based on the growth rate that had occurred the previous 10 years, 80% of the land would be covered with cars. We didn't think that was sustainable, and we didn't think that was going to happen. When you think about transportation, and in particular the automobile, it's really about the freedom to go where you want to, when you want to, with the people you want to travel with, carrying the goods that you would like to travel, like to take with you. But the real challenge is one of sustainability. And typically the focus of that discussion is on energy and environment, safety, which is truly an ethics issue, with 1.2 million people a year dying on roadways. These are pedestrians and motorcyclists, as well as people in automobiles, and affordability, in particular equality of access, which is also an important concern from an ethics standpoint. But when you get to cities, congestion and parking may be more definitive than any of the other four. In fact, the value proposition of an automobile, go where you want to, when you want to, gets compromised considerably when you have significant congestion and you can't find a place to park it. So we got thinking about the fundamental genetic makeup of automobiles. And in fact, those genes were created over 120 years ago. When Benz drove his first car out of the barn in the late 1800s, it was mechanically driven, powered by an internal combustion engine, energized by petroleum, mechanically controlled, and it was a standalone machine. And it's interesting that for over a century, that fundamental DNA has remained the same. That describes our cars and trucks today. And there's a reason for that. There's a great deal of codependence between the machine, the car, the roadways that they operate on, and how they're energized. We think we've entered into a period that's now going to be transformational with a new DNA, electrically driven machines, powered by electric motors, which happen to be 3 times as efficient as internal combustion engines, energized by electricity and hydrogen, which can go back and forth between each other and can serve different purposes, electronically controlled, and very, very importantly, electronically interconnected. And that connectivity is going to prove to be a major opportunity. We see a world where cars don't crash. They don't run into each other. They don't run into pedestrians. They don't run into bicyclists. Every car that's being built going forward has GPS systems on it. And the GPS let you know where your vehicle is relative to another vehicle within a meter. And if you share wheel speeds and steering inputs between vehicles, you can predict where they'll be within the next 20 milliseconds. And many of us now walk around with handheld devices with GPS. And so there is a future out there where cars don't crash. Now, if cars don't crash, you can get a lot of mass out of them, or the weight of the car. And that becomes important, and I'll illustrate that in a second. We also see a world where cars can drive themselves. A lot of times people are concerned about driver distraction. Studying automobile consumers led me to believe that driving was the distraction. Why else would someone possibly send a text message driving a 3,000 to 4,000 pound machine at 70 miles an hour if it wasn't more important to send that message than to drive safely? So we began to explore how might we create cars that can drive themselves. If you know where you are, GPS and digital maps, and the digital maps are becoming enormously information rich. You know what's around you with 360-degree sensing and vehicle-to-vehicle communication, sharing data between vehicles. And you know how to go where your car knows where it wants to go or where you want to go with software and algorithms. You can do just that. Now, this is a vehicle called BOSS that competed in a competition for autonomous driving vehicles a few years back. It's a General Motors vehicle. We teamed with Carnegie Mellon University and some suppliers. What was interesting about that competition, 85 teams entered it. It was a $2 million prize for the team that could create a vehicle that could go 60 miles in a city in less than 6 hours and obey all traffic laws. Now, GM needed the money at the time because we were going bankrupt, so that's why we went after the $2 million. But fortunately, we won. That didn't head off the bankruptcy. But this is just a very short video. It's like a ghost just driving the car. Now, there's no remote control. There's nobody in the vehicle. This is a totally autonomous, smart vehicle driving itself. And so now you begin to think about this, electrically driven vehicles and the ability to have cars drive themselves. That led to this idea of what we're calling a mobility internet. Now, we all know about the Internet of Information. That's the one we use every day. There's another internet that's coming forth quite fast. It's the smart grid, or you might call that the Internet of Electrons. The mobility internet is the Internet of Atoms. It has to do with knowing everything you want to know about where everything is and where everyone is and where they want to go and where you want these goods to move, and taking advantage of that information real time in order to connect us much more efficiently with much less variation in travel time than the way we're conducted today. And to do that in ways that might really make you curious. Now, here's an animation of a vision of these vehicles being operated and controlled via mobility internet. You can see the driver can be distracted because it's autonomously driven. This is really the moment I like the most in this animation. The point is, we can do a lot with this technology. Now, here is an example of this concept, the ENV, in a somewhat animated view that might look like New York City. Notice how close they can follow each other. Notice the cars are stuck in traffic, which is part of the point. And notice that these vehicles are about 1/5 the size of those automobiles. And they're moving around and interacting in a city in a much more spatially friendly and efficient way. And that really led to the whole concept behind what was at the World Expo. It was reinventing the automobile and providing personal urban mobility for the 21st century. Now, I talked about the growth of automobiles in Shanghai. I didn't mention the electric scooters. Last year, 25 million electric scooters were sold in China. So you think about that step from an electric scooter to a full-blown automobile. There's some big white space there that might give us an opportunity. So you start with electrification, driving the cars electrically, all kinds of advantages in the design of the automobile in doing that. You then bring in this connectivity, and the intersection of those two give you that new automotive DNA that I talked about. You bring in urbanization, and urbanization and electrification let you think about smart grids and charging infrastructure, and urbanization and connectivity allow us to talk about the mobility internet and dynamic pricing markets, where now you're charging for that differential space of roadway that you occupy in an instance and second. Sort of like parking when you're stopped, but now you're doing it in the real-time movement of the vehicle, and that's how those cars can go through the intersection the way we showed in the animation. Everybody has a reserved space-time path through the city, and no one else will intersect that path at that instance in time. We put that together into the notion of reinventing personal urban mobility. And this is the book that grew out of that with Bill Mitchell. Unfortunately, Bill passed away recently, but he was a renowned professor in architecture and urban planning and information technology at MIT, my colleague Chris Broney-Bird from General Motors, and myself. Now let me talk about this vehicle just one last minute. Today, when we drive our automobiles, 25% of the energy in a gallon of gasoline actually makes it to the wheels to propel the vehicle. 75% of that energy is lost as heat when it's combusted out the exhaust pipe and friction. These automobiles that we drive today tend to weigh 3,000 to 4,000 pounds to move people around that weigh about 150 pounds. So 5% of the mass of movement is the person and the rest is the vehicle. 5% of 25% is 1%. 1% of the energy in a gallon of gasoline is actually being used for the mission of moving a person from point A to point B. So when people say we have an energy challenge, I say no, we don't. We have a system design challenge. We have enormous opportunities to change that. These vehicles, the ENVs that we're talking about in this book, weigh 750 pounds with the person in it. So that's a reduction of 1/4 at least. And the electric drive is 3 times as efficient. 3 times 4 is 12. There's a 12x opportunity to transition to this class of personal mobility machine in cities. They park in 1/5 the area that a car parks in, and they won't crash because of the connected vehicle technology that we have. You may have picked it up in the first animation. You can park them in your closet. This is a fashion item. And
Where's all your stuff?
yeah, and that's what you really have to appeal to. You have to give consumers a value proposition. And when you add it all up, because these can't be stolen because you can track them with GPS and the parking efficiency, about 1/5 the total cost per mile to move around in a vehicle like this as it would an automobile. So we think there's a great opportunity to address the serious concerns on roadway fatalities, the serious concerns on energy consumption and CO2, and very importantly, the quality of life of cities. And we're hoping that we can move this to market as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Cool, Larry. Thank you. We'll come. It's cool stuff. It's totally cool, gee whiz stuff, and we're going to go to things that don't move in a second. But one of the things that I think is startling is the degree of transformation. And when you say a 12x opportunity, you can compare that to, improving cafe standards or miles per gallon to, if we could get up to from 35 miles a gallon to 70 miles a gallon, we'd only be doubling the opportunity, which is trivial in comparison to what we're talking about here. So it's kind of pretty cool stuff. Earlier this year, I was involved a little bit with Shell and its Eco Marathon, which is a contest among college students to come identify high experimental vehicles that get very high miles per equivalent of a liter of fuel. Sometimes they're solar, sometimes they're hydrogen, sometimes they're gasoline. The leading car in the German version this year was actually this little, cigar-shaped car that got the equivalent of 7,000 kilometers on 1 liter of fuel, which somebody pointed out is the distance from Paris to Moscow and back. And if you thought about what Napoleon could have done with that, life would have been a lot simpler, though the roads probably weren't very smooth and weren't able to take care. You probably wouldn't have gotten that in real urban or real driving on real roads. But let me pass the baton over to Joan Krevlin. Joan is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. She's a founding partner of BKSK Architects and has specialized in community design for decades. She, among other things, designed the Queens Botanical Garden Visiting Center, which was the first public building in New York City to receive a Platinum LEED designation. So, Joan, talk to us about the stuff that doesn't move in the city.
Cars are way cooler, as much as we love buildings. And I think in some ways where this is looking to the future, I think in some ways we're almost looking to the past in terms of how we rethink how we design. Technology isn't always our solution. In some ways, moving away from technology is a better approach for buildings. So why do we care about buildings when we talk about sustainable cities? If you look at energy use, buildings consume 40% of all the energy used in our country, generate 40% of all the carbon emissions, and use about 40% of the world's materials. So the act of sort of living, creating, and inhabiting buildings has a huge impact in our energy use. And these numbers really compel us to recognize that changing the way how buildings are created and operated can make a huge impact in the threats of climate change. So the phrase sustainable architecture has been sort of around, and I think the first thing is to say, what do we mean by sustainable architecture, and how do we define that terminology? And I think that one of the best is a phrase that's been coined some time ago, which says that sustainable architecture is a design that improves the quality of life today without diminishing it for the next generation. And I appreciate your reference always to the notion of quality earlier, because I think that's something that we'll talk about when we look at how we make buildings that are more energy efficient, more resource-wise, but also have a real qualitative aspect attached to it that in some ways in our way that we make buildings and live in buildings, we've forgotten. And I think that we want to sort of connect back to. So the sustainable design principles really include the ability to optimize site potential, to really look at the land on which we're building and how we impact that as habitat, how we think about water use, water falling on that site, how we think about building orientation, how we minimize non-renewable energy consumption. And actually, before we minimize renewable energy consumption, we first have to think about how we build in ways that are much more efficient. So we make a building that needs less energy, and then we look to non-renewable energy consumption to kind of fill that gap when we first have a lower demand, because we think about the envelope of how we build, right sizing what we build, and then when we've sort of got that sort of to its best equation, how do we fill that gap of energy needs with more renewable sources of energy? How we protect and conserve water, how we enhance the indoor environmental quality, and I think this is the one that's often forgotten in the discussion, but really key, is how do we optimize operational and maintenance practices? Because often we can build very well, but if we don't have a building that actually is functioning the way it's supposed to, much of that effort can be lost. So really understanding how we build, how we bring maintenance folks into thinking, how we use our buildings and care for our buildings is part of the equation. So we've seen in the last 10 years what I'd say is really a sea change. And I think that the Queen's Botanical Garden project that you mentioned was something that was, we were brought to design in 2000. It took 8 years, because it's a city-funded building, to actually build it. But in that period of time, we saw a real sea change in the architectural and the building profession about how people really looked at and understood sustainable design. And I think that it's interesting to kind of look at what allowed that sea change to happen, because then it helps us to think, how do we then go forward for yet what's got to be even more change and more of a critical change. So it starts in many ways with the U.S. Green Building Council. I wouldn't say it starts there, but I think that they were really probably the driving kind of nonprofit force that pulled together a consortium of manufacturers, architects, engineers, government organizations, contractors, people involved, and began to look at how do we kind of redefine the conversation, how do we kind of, or actually not even redefine, how do we set up to have a way to talk about sustainable building practice? And they launched in 1998 the first LEED rating system. You probably all know what LEED is by now, but it's Leadership in Energy Environmental Design, and it's really a green building ranking system that's a point system that's become sort of the national benchmark for design, construction, and operation of high-performance green buildings. So what it did is it gave a common language to the building industry. So instead of saying, oh yeah, my building's green, or I'm doing this, it became a standard by which things could be looked at and evaluated. And in doing so, it sort of set a market trend that allowed us to know what we needed to do in many ways to achieve certain green standards, and let the kind of whole building industry have a common language to talk to itself about products that were needed, ways to evaluate energy use, so that there could be a kind of movement forward. And just to kind of sum up their 5 categories, because leaders always looked at in these 5 categories, it's sustainable, and it ties back to the original criteria I said earlier: sustainable sites, water efficiency, energy and atmosphere, materials and resources, and indoor environmental quality. And within that point system, there was a range of kind of standards that you could achieve that allowed people to set, or clients, builders, architects, to set goals that were appropriate to their particular building and sort of have, again, sort of achieve certain sustainable standards. It allowed for a huge market transformation. And I think that's in many ways what's propelled the sea change, that with this common language, now we see almost a mainstream thinking about the language of green building. And so I think the first question, actually, how did this happen? What made LEED the successful kind of vehicle it was? Because what can we then learn from it? Because LEED is a flawed system, and it's not a perfect system, and we'll talk about some of the kind of downfalls of it, but what made it so successful? It was very clever in a way. Part of it is that it was market-driven, and it was kind of balanced in a philosophy of sort of street-smart sort of practices that were understood, that were achievable now, with pushing into sort of more innovative technology. So you could come at it from known technologies, and you could push the boundaries, so that there was a way to sort of come into it from different perspectives. It rewarded competition. We're all a little bit competitive, but by having this point system, you can talk to your client about whether they want it to be certified silver, gold, or platinum. And we are a competitive society, and that ability to either meet a standard that allowed you to spend more money or less money to achieve these goals was useful, but also kind of pushed that little competitive urge to sort of ever and ever, if you get that extra 2 points, you can be in gold. It pushed it, allowed them to sort of push the conversation. So it was kind of clever in sort of picking up sort of our own competitive nature. And it was actually essentially a consensus-focused metric, because the decision-making was made up from across the board in the industry, so it wasn't as top-down even though we use it as a certain kind of way, it was a consensus-driven sort of process, and it had third-party verification, so that there was an outside evaluator of whether your design process and then your built product met certain kind of criteria. So it allowed, in I would say in that 10 years, or now it's 12 years that LEED first introduced itself, to go through several iterations of how it changed its standardization. But it became sort of the language of sustainable architecture. There are other rating systems that are around, and we'll talk about some other in a minute. But it kind of allowed it to have something to hold on to and propel this, this conversation. The problems that it presented in many ways were that, when you have something that's a point-based system, we saw that in the earlier days you'd sit down with your consultants and your team and you'd have very kind of interesting conversations about how to really think how the form of your building, the siding of the building, the way air moved through it, where daylight, how it could really affect the design and shaping of a project in ways that were very conceptual. And then, like many things, it turned into how do you get a point, and it became sort of like, point-driven, and, the old, sort of, it's a problem they've corrected, but it used to be that you could get the same point for having a bike rack outside of your building as you could for having a very expensive, complicated, multi-control system, air conditioning system. So the kind of the cost of a bike rack and maybe a shower, and the cost of how they were kind of different, and they were so they're and in the kind of newer looking at the LEED system, many of those things have been addressed. It's it's a little bit generic. It wasn't as regionally and locally focused. Things in urban environments are very different in terms of more rural environments, and so it's begun to evolve, and it's corrected a lot of the issues, and it's very focused. The USGBC is very focused now on how do we sort of look to see what's really working, because looking after the fact and see, are these kind of innovations that we're doing really doing what they're supposed to do in terms of reducing energy use and cost, is something that really now is a great focus of conversation to make sure the things that we set out to do are actually happening. So looking at sort of how do we sort of verify whether things are actually, how do we do sort of assessment of what we've done is very much a part of the conversation. But it's kind of a way to look at something that says we know the standard of how we build, and how can we, by what percentage can we do better? And there are many in the sustainable field who are saying that's not really good enough, and that we really need to set a different kind of standard that allows us to really rethink how buildings integrate with the ecology or the natural, the sort of the natural world in which they exist. And a good example of it is what's called the Living Building Challenge, which is sort of another arm of sort of that grew out of USGBC's efforts, and it's really looking to push projects even further, so that providing a different kind of model, really changing the paradigm of how we build. So looking for really net zero energy buildings, so that the building is actually either producing as much energy as it's consuming, or producing more energy than it's consuming, so that we're sort of changing the equation of how we think that buildings work. Net zero water use, replacing habitat that's disturbed, and not making these things optional, but in that system of evaluating buildings, all of those things are prerequisites. Everything is a mandate. So whereas with LEED, the ability to pick and choose and kind of contour it makes sense for your particular project, gets you off the hook on some things while solving other problems. And so what the Living Building Challenge is really trying to do is not just make buildings perform better against a kind of understood standard, but to really rethink how we understand the role that buildings can play. And I actually think when I was recently looking at the list of prerequisites, prerequisite means you have to do it. One of their prerequisites is beauty and spirit, which I think is kind of interesting. And the way it reads in their language is the project must contain design features intended solely for human delight and the celebration of culture, spirit, and place appropriate to the function of the building. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That's kind of a nice thing to say. And then I asked myself, who is really deciding whether or not you've reached that kind of goal? And it gets a little tricky in there in terms of these qualitative aspects of who decides whether we've met that kind of standard. And yet, I do think it does address something that we see, those of us who have been thinking about how the changing way that we build buildings, it really does talk about an aesthetic of sustainability. And I think that that's a really not only important factor of what we do, but as architects, in some ways, one of the most compelling. And I think it's really sort of changing how we think about our building in relationship to the natural forces. And I have a favorite little book that's called Thermal Delight in Architecture by Lisa Heschong. And it's a very small book, and it's really lovely reading. And it really talks about the hypothesis that the thermal function of a building can be used as an effective design element. And that we have forgotten in the way we've now insulated and thought our buildings as these kind of sealed environments that we can air condition and, you know, sort of seal from any outdoor forces, that when we look at thermal qualities, warm, cool, humid, airy, radiant, you know, sort of all the conditions outside, those actually become really useful design tools and qualitative aspects of how we experience the place that we're in and the places that we're building. And it becomes a rethinking of how we think about our buildings in the places that we build. And we all know this, you know, when we think about what it's nice to, you know, we live in the city, we probably turn on our air conditioning, and many people in this room probably go to their country house where they really love the fact they can sit on their porch or have a nice breeze, you know, fall asleep to you know, the sense of a breeze wafting over you, you know, looking at, you know, indigenous cultures, looking at the way courtyards have been used, the way hearths have been used. You know, all of those things that were part of a kind of vernacular architecture are the things that we long for often when we go to vacation spots or, you know, that sense of connection. And when you look at how you think about those as elements of design, that we connect how we think about buildings to seasonal and daily change and connections to that climate, it's one of the things that really enriches our sense of place. And so I think that we have this kind of qualitative thing that comes with kind of the metrics of trying to look at performance that actually is enriching and, you know, makes for better placemaking. And we talked about the Queen's Botanical Garden, and I think just to talk about that project very briefly, it was a project for a garden that's in Queens, Flushing, Queens. It's, you know, densest community, probably densest county in the city with the greatest ethnic diversity in the whole city. And the Queen's Botanical Garden, a 39-acre garden, which is the hidden botanical garden because nobody's ever heard of it, really serves as a backyard to many of the people who live in that dense urban environment. And they kind of had always seen themselves as a place where culture and plants came together. People, plants, and culture come together. That was their mission. And they redefined their mission to be a place that could showcase themselves as stewards of the environment. And did a whole series of workshops with all their kind of different constituents who came there from really all around the world, and found that water was a real common element, that everybody related to water. When we were, and then they got capital fund, and they did a master plan that was based on this notion of water. We got hired as architects to build their first capital project. So we were building a building that was going to represent the new mission of a garden, garden, right? So it's not, we weren't making a garden. And we were trying to really speak to what at first we saw were these dual missions. How do you kind of acknowledge all this diverse culture that's sharing this space? And how do you showcase themselves as stewards of the environment? And we realized that they were really one and the same, that in many ways, cultural communality came from realizing that no matter where you were from, everybody had daily rituals and connections to the natural environment that resonated for them. And so we designed a building that really tried to, it received elite platinum, so it hit lots and lots of metrics. It has a geothermal system, it has photovoltaics, it, you know, has lots of, you know, it has an air conditioning system that has, you know, variable controls. It hit a lot of the metrics of performance that were essential to having a high-performing building. But what it also really did was it connected visitors who came to the building to the sense of place, much like being in a garden did, so that there's a large roof that collects the water that falls on the site. A rainy day is a good day to be in the garden. You hear it falling. The rain is then collected on this roof, brought down into a cleansing biotope, which cleanses a lot of the pollutants out of it, and that becomes the water course that runs through the site and the building that spoke to the water that everybody wanted on the site. So we like to say that a rainy day is a good day to be in the garden. It's not a bad day, it's a nice day to be there. There's a wood brise soleil that filters the light, that the skin of the bar of the building is made up of a wood brise soleil, which is like open Venetian blinds with glass doors sliding behind, so that skin of the building becomes almost like a layer of clothes. You can open and close it in various ways so that you can connect to the breezes and you can deal with the sun in ways, and you have these incredible shadows that fall on the floor from the way the sun moves in the building. So you're aware of moving light changing season in a way that's kind of lovely. So that kind of qualitative aspect of how we think about place is something that thinking about green design really allows us to kind of engage with our clients. So I think that, so the point I want to make about that building, about that is that ability to take sort of the metrics of performance and turn them into something that is qualitative impact can really change how we build and really change the quality of life.
So what we've heard, this is fabulous, and I love the image of the image of the garden and how and the building in the garden and how it sort of becomes internal and external. Some of us, I don't know how many of us are city mice. but I'm very much a city mouse, or maybe a city rat at this point. But I remember when my daughter was 2.5 years old, and we went up and stayed in, had a house in the country, and it was early August, and the crickets were I live on 96th Street and on the east side, so we've got Mount Sinai on the one, we've got sort of two hospitals on either end of 96th Street on the east side, so and buses and so on and so forth. So we have a fairly noisy street, and my daughter got quite used to all of that. But when we came up to the country, she was not used to the sound of the crickets. And at one point, she was going to bed and trying to go to sleep, and it was an early August night, and these crickets were chirping, billions and billions of crickets chirping loudly outside her door. And finally, she said, "What's that noise, Marty? What's that noise?" I said, "It's crickets, honey. Tell them to stop." But she got used to it fairly quickly, and quickly got back to, I guess not the thermal delight, but the oral delight of country life. I want to ask, before we open this up to you guys, and you guys I really want to hear from quickly in terms of questions, but I would like each of the panel, each of you have sort of described a vision of the future. You have described, an amazing sort of choreography of automobiles of the future. You've described buildings of the future. You've described some of the requirements of the future. But as we discovered earlier, when I was asking you about the houses we live in and the offices we work in, we also live very much in the present. And I think there are also some issues of sustainability in cities and sustainability in societies that have to do not with what we invent and discover in the future, but also how we retrofit what we have and what we live in now. And I'm wondering if you think about priorities in sort of about how we can get what is the opportunity in the green retrofit or the sustainability retrofit of existing systems and urban infrastructure in wherever you want to pick that question up. How do we improve what we live in now while we invent what we're going to, or live in and transport ourselves in now while we invent those opportunities for the future? Does anyone want to take that up first?
There were a couple of examples in Freiburg and Malmö. Those were existing cities where they have and in Portland, where they have a vision of the future. They really want to reduce their carbon footprint. But again, it's a long-term opportunity.
Was it a key changing in incentives? What is it? I mean, something's got to get people saying, I can get to business not as usual while living in my same old digs. I mean, something's got to change the equation here.
A lot of it's policy. Mm-hmm. It's policy that'll shape things. Mm-hmm. Policy that provides the economic viability, but also sort of the financing to make these changes.
Mm-hmm. Larry, how important is this opportunity?
We're talking about challenges that have massive scale. And the only mechanism I know how to scale solutions to a level that matters on global energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions is the market. So in simple terms, the answer is greed.
Okay.
And
how big is the retrofitting opportunity in transportation and mobility?
We need to be driving towards solutions where the consumer value exceeds the market price and the market price exceeds the supplier cost, and do that in an unsubsidized way. And when you hit that tipping point, when you get that right, then people in the course of living their everyday lives, because they simply like the new solution, are going to gravitate there, and the capital is going to flow there for the new solution. So I think the key is to really deeply understand people as consumers. We don't consume energy for the sake of consuming energy. We consume it through the food we eat, through the water we drink, through the way we shop, through the way we educate ourselves, through the way we move around and interact, how we make things. And there's an enormous amount of waste in how we do that today. And so we need to find these new mechanisms that lead us through greed, but through self-interest, to the opportunities that truly exist. Now, I don't think we're going to be able to take a step from all of the technology that exists today into brownfield cities and pull that off. As an engineer, I like to design the simplest experiment possible. And one of the things I'm working on at Columbia University in my role as the director of the Roundtable on Sustainable Mobility is to try to find a place. There's two that we're exploring right now, Chongming Island near Shanghai and Babcock Ranch, which is in Florida, but a place which would be a new town, where we can begin to integrate the convergence of all of the building technology that we have, the energy technology, the mobility technology, and very importantly, the information technology, and create that commercial ecosystem, the suppliers coming together with real people living in real communities, because it's about learning cycles. It's getting out there, getting started and learning and making it better. I think that's the path we can lead to, and I certainly see it. I'm very optimistic by nature. I think these problems are solvable. I think we have huge opportunities to do it, and there's going to be a lot of business growth that comes with those opportunities.
So you're fundamentally thinking that the brownfield opportunity comes from showing the greenfield
Yeah, you gotta
future
show me.
and then going back from the future
Show me,
to
yeah.
retrofit the present,
Yeah.
and rather than going forward from the present to the future.
It's a really important question for building. You know, if we look at 85% of the buildings that we're going to occupy in 2030 exist today. So that if we're looking at really having, you know, real change, we have to look at how to deal with the building stock that we have. And, you know, there's certain initiatives. So I think that from that case, it's regulatory, it's policy, and then it's market driven. So, you know, the city is trying to regulate building audits so that buildings have to do energy audits. What they're not quite there yet is to kind of mandate the fixes yet, once you sort of identify where the issues are. But having there be both kind of benchmarking the performance of existing buildings and having that become available public information so that as people are making market decisions about what buildings to buy or to live in, they can understand the energy cost of their buildings that they're in. So that I think that from a building point of view, we have this building stock that absolutely has to be addressed. And it's going to be a combination of policy and then economic incentive to really sort of address it in any meaningful way. There's also huge opportunity when you look at all for example, the roofs in the city. You know, it's a great unexplored, you know, in terms of green roofs, urban agriculture. You know, we have sort of a whole other playing field that's at a high level. How we deal with water management, and we're not talking about water here because that's a whole other conversation, particularly in the city in terms of, you know, sort of how we manage the water that falls and how are we going to deal with rising sea levels, but how we use roofs as a way to deal with both water management, stormwater management, urban agriculture, urban heat island effect. There's a lot of opportunity to address certain problems by looking at that new lay of the land in a way.
You know, one of the things you mentioned reminded me of a story that happened to my brother-in-law, who was involved in a program in the city, I guess during the Arab oil crisis and the Carter administration. There was a lot of money that came from Washington that went to Albany that was to be offered to landlords for new furnaces, new windows, weather stripping, you know, sort of fundamental building improvement kind of things. And my brother-in-law, one of my brother-in-law's responsibilities was to try to take some of that money from Albany and give it to landlords. And one of the real difficulties he had in certain parts of Manhattan was to identify a landlord, because the landlord existed inside a shell corporation, inside a shell corporation, inside a shell corporation, and the tax incentive that landlord might be offered for weather stripping was as nothing compared to the tax incentive he got from the tax avoidance he got from this set of shell corporations. And so there was a certain, just as much energy was as is wasted in an internal combustion automobile. You know, that's about as much of this weather stripping opportunity that actually managed to trickle down to windows in the city, because, you know, why would you got to get your policy structure right and your various other kinds of transparency right, even to be able to make those changes. Let's open it up to you guys. If you have questions that are directed at one person in particular, will you do that? Will you please also identify who you are? And do we have roving mics? So Devin, that hand went up first, so why don't we start there, and then we'll go there, and then we'll go there, and then we'll go there.
Just a quick announcement. Please let my colleague Stephanie hold the mic when you give your question. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Bridwell, and I teach international business at Pace University. And I want to ask you to compare the future of democratic India and democratic USA to communist China in being able to do this re-engineering. As you probably know better than I do, that China right now is really advanced when it comes to electric batteries and high-speed trains, etc. And in terms of the massive re-engineering, is a government where the technocrats make the decisions and the communist government implements them going to be more effective than democratically paralyzed Indian United States?
Who would like to pick that one up first? Okay.
I think that's
Larry, and then Sartaz, I really would like, you've worked in some of these environments, so I'd like to hear you on this.
Yes.
Right.
it's a phenomenal question because the rate at which things are moving in China is just unbelievable. And I'm fundamentally concerned about the U.S. political system. Just seems to be at a standstill, and the decision-making we need to take us where we need to go. Personally, I don't think anything needs to be invented to solve a lot of the sustainable mobility challenges that we're addressing. And in China, they can simply decide that's the direction they're going to go in, and they pull together the collective will. Whether the word will is appropriate in that context, I'm not sure. But this marrying of the communistic system with capitalism and a market-driven economy is really, really pretty remarkable. And you can't argue that it hasn't worked in the sense of the rate at which that economy is growing. So we need a direction in our nation. We need policy. I'm not just going to simply say energy policy because I don't think the issue is simply an energy issue. I think it's an issue with respect to how we lead our lives. And to put this in perspective, I remind myself almost every day that the smartest 25% of the people in China equal the population of the United States. They're extraordinarily capable engineers. The execution of what's taking place there is first rate. And we need to have some good dialogue on your question because we're going to get left behind if we don't watch it here.
Sartaz, you've worked in both places.
Yes. And to Larry's point, maybe the solutions that are developed in China or in places like the Middle East where the government sort of dictates things will come into solution. Once they come into solution, will be adopted by the US and India. You know? So both sides work.
Boy, I would like to hear somebody speak up for the opportunity to be less than directive in this. And I don't know, but let's hope we can get to that. Let's hope we can get to that question. You had a question here, did you? Yeah.
You had the microphones going over there. When I would have dinner with the mayor of Shanghai, that person typically was a physicist or an engineer. And in Detroit, my mayor was Kwame Kilpatrick, who's now a felon in prison. So, I don't know.
Felon, fellow, what's the difference?
Hi, I'm Michelle Fonzo from Four Corners Consulting. Much of the work I do is in the developing world, so my question is more towards the developing world. Globally, urbanization each year is expanding at 4.2% right now. Probably isn't going to stop anytime soon. And the majority of those people living in cities are in developing countries. What I've heard the panel discuss is that forward-thinking policies and market capital seem to be the levers for moving sustainable cities forward. How does that overlay with the developing world, which doesn't have much money and often doesn't have forward-thinking governments?
Sartaz,
Well, I was just wondering whether you consider China a developing country.
It is. I would say it's a special case, though.
Right.
A lot of work I do is in Africa and Southeast Asia and Afghanistan.
Right. Then, I mean, there are small examples. When we have looked at it, we haven't seen broad policy efforts the way we have seen in China, but we have seen small-scale solutions, be it with solar cooking stoves or, you know, battery leasing to provide energy, sort of solar panels for electricity. So there's sort of small-scale solutions that we've seen, but not sort of the broad policy push that obviously we've seen in China and to a certain extent in Brazil.
It's interesting if you think about some of the, and this is not an urbanization issue per se, but if you think, as I understand it, the single biggest thing you could do for carbon consumption and air quality in India is get kerosene out of cooking stoves in 1.5 million, or more than that, in billions, in all these little cooking stoves in villages and in cities, and that would be sort of a massive improvement in air quality. I guess get kerosene out and also manure out as cooking fuel. So there may be a lot of low tech solutions there. But do you know much about? I mean, as you look at cities, and particularly the urbanization issue in a Lagos or whatever.
This is kind of a not informed answer, but it's kind of a gut answer, which is that to not look at the models of success that we've generated here. You know, like as I think developing countries kind of look to, what looks like excellence, or what looks like success, or what looks like prosperity. We've sort of set a paradigm of what sort of sophisticated buildings look like, and they're a false paradigm in a way. They make no sense in lots of places. And we look back at more indigenous forms of architecture to learn lessons from. And I always am concerned that what we've modeled is sort of bad behavior here, and that so how do we change sort of what that model looks like so that you can go to the larger cities in different parts of Africa and places, and you can see some of the things that that look like they could be buildings that lifted from Houston and put in Kigali or something, and you think why is that? Because it's kind of a model of what prosperity looks like, or what a model of sort of development looks like, and it's somehow debunking that as what quality looks like.
I think it would be very interesting. I mean, one of the things that terrifies me is you think that we have a model of moving from rural squalor to urban squalor, or rural sustainability to urban squalor, and to a favela or a some sort of like Lagos, or some sort of failed city. And yet we also see these images in Korea and India and China and Turkey, various other places around the world of these greenfield, sort of amazing sustainable cities being built. And I guess the question is, can we get from the village to a city that is not, without going through the favela sort of phase, and can we leapfrog beyond that? And I don't know of too many glorious examples of it, and I think we ought to find them. And we had a question over here. I think. Sorry, Laurie, go ahead. And then
Columbia's Earth Institute has a Millennium Villages and Millennium Cities program, and they're trying to work at these exact issues. And Einstein once said, "The best design is the simplest one that works." And I think that is a very, very important area to be solving problems, because it's driving simple solutions that should transfer back to the developed world. I mean, if you can become a very efficient oven for those purposes, why not bring it back to the developed world?
That's working in a lot of other sort of business opportunities. That's interesting. Sort of the bottom of the pyramid up design, in country for country design, is working in other business areas, so it should work there. Yeah.
Hi. I'm Luciana Marulli from the United Nations, and the question is directly, in particular, to Joan Krevlin. Could you possibly expand a bit more on, indeed, the best practices that might have been adopted, also in developed countries, to keep the people living in the country as a sustainable society with access to services and so on? I believe, to answer my own question, that something was done in Norway.
In Norway?
Norway.
I can't speak to that.
Any other country.
And I think that you said two things that I think are kind of interesting, and I don't know that architecture can solve all of them. One is kind of best practices in terms of how we build and how we live, and I think that's acknowledging the particular conditions of where you are. Understanding the conditions of rainfall, understanding the conditions of solar conditions, and really kind of having, a building solution that's appropriate. But I think the second part of what you said had to do with sort of sustainable societies and access to work. How do we build? People move from rural areas to urban areas because they have access to jobs, they have access to communities, they don't need transportation. I mean, all of those things that sort of allow people to survive, right? They leave rural areas because they can't sustain themselves. And so it's kind of looking at it in a more multidisciplinary way in terms of how do we look at the integrated things that allow people to sustain themselves. And I think, unfortunately, buildings are the easier solutions than those larger questions of, access to work, jobs, transportation, food, those things. So it's a big question.
We had a question here. I think we have sort of two questions at this table. Actually, we have three questions. Why don't we just stay at this table for a couple of minutes? But then you guys have been silent, so we have to come to you guys next, all right?
Mine is less of a question and more of a comment about the developing countries question. I think that there's an opportunity to look at the people that are living in those situations and the innovations that they're driving themselves. An example of that are there's not a sort of delicate way of saying this, but the trash-picking societies that exist in the favelas and the more destitute areas of those countries. They're actually innovating incredible technologies for recycling and collecting, and their waste systems are much more efficient than ours in New York. A good example of that is the Coptic Christian collection of people in Cairo, Egypt. They have served as a model for societies in South America and Africa to not only recycle all of the waste of the entire city, but to create income and build their own cities that are more sustainable and improving the conditions that they live in
the value of
situation.
indigenous solutions, and as we're saying, certainly in other areas, Western companies have discovered that you don't sell to emerging markets by stripping out features. You sell to emerging markets by designing in and for those markets, and then you can actually bring that stuff back to developed markets. Yes, sir.
Actually, then
And if you could identify, please identify yourself. Sure. If I have a question to ask.
Sure. Howard Levy. My company's Red Rooster Group, and we do marketing for sustainable businesses. So this question, in some way, builds upon what you're asking. In answer to your proposition, Joan, who will evaluate the aesthetic criteria, for example, of that building? The obvious answer seems to be the tenants or residents of the building. And I've noticed a lack of participation in the process by the actual users of, for example, in the architecture profession, LEED is top down by a government agency. The experts are the architects. So the question is, where is the role for the people in the process? And the larger question is, like, will the Green Revolution, or is the Green Revolution being driven by a top-down or by the people? And so, for example, even with Larry, the question of these amazing cars, is that ultimately going to be imposed by government or corporate interest, or by demand from the people?
So, Joan, this is your opportunity to answer the question about India and China. That was our first question, but sort of, where is the vox populi in this?
Well, I really like your question. It's an important question, and I think that one of the things that we've seen, with this slight paradigm shift about how we think about how we build, is that there is a rethinking of the role of the architect. In the sense that to really build sustainably, it's a much more integrated process with multiple voices at the table to understand what makes for a successful solution. So that model of sort of the genius architect no longer really makes sense.
Are you please telling us that Ayn Rand is over?
She is over. She is
yes!
completely
yes!
over.
Okay.
And we can now officially say that's done. And and it starts kind of from the top-down team, but then it brings in the user to the mix. And what I mean by that is that you can no longer sort of solve these kinds of problems if you sort of design a building, then call in your landscape architect, your mechanical engineer, and say, okay, now how do you cool it? How do you? Because they have to be at the table very early, because the solutions really need to grow out of a collective understanding of the problem that needs to be solved. And I do think that the user plays a critical role in that. And I think that, I can't speak for all architects, because architects are a sort of egocentric kind of crowd. But I do think that there is a bit of a shift in the thinking that sort of makes you realize that, if it used to take a village to raise a kid, it kind of takes at least a large group to create an effective building that's going to serve those needs over time. So I do think that there is a shift in thinking about the role of the architect and the importance of sort of seeing that as a more integrated collective process.
Larry, I want you to pick up this too, because of course the value proposition of the automobile has been, as you I think expressed it, that you can go where you want, when you want, with whom you want, and so on and so forth, and that has been very much that sort of, it's like the equivalent, it's bicycles are to 12-year-olds what automobiles are to people who are 18 and over, and it sort of gives you that sort of individual mobility. And I think that the same question has to do with transportation systems, is how much do you, how much is it the people voting collectively or making decisions collectively about how much freedom they want, how much freedom they will restrict? How do we get this thing done right?
Yeah, it's in the auto industry, we wrestle with that all the time, that dynamic between the creative genius of an individual designer and the collective strength of the diversity of a group. And so you have to work on that. The automobile is a fashion good. I mean, people write songs about the automobile. Prince wrote Little Red Corvette. He didn't write Little Red Laptop Computer. So there's something to that. And when I get asked, why did General Motors go bankrupt? It's because we lost our focus on the consumer, the customer, trying to understand really, really, really deeply the overall experience that customers have with our product. And so I don't think you can go wrong by really deeply focusing on the entire aspect of the customer experience and drive your innovation toward making all aspects positive and getting rid of the negatives. And if you get that right, then the consumers will come. But you have to be real careful about it being a democratic decision process, because there is something to be said about individual creative genius that leads to breakthrough ideas. And we're balancing it all the time. I found one set of tools that I found very refreshing, consumer ethnography. So rather than trying to understand the customer through surveys, you understand them deeply by observing. And oftentimes what you observe is really the key insight. It's not what a consumer says, it's what you can observe and infer from that.
That's the great Yogi Berra line, right? You can see a lot just by looking. We have a question here, sir. Yes.
Robert James. I'm a businessman in New York. I've been in the oil business for a long time, and I'm invested in green energy too. The green I always made money in were tax refunds. The company went broke, but I made money. Okay, my question is this. Under what circumstances do you favor sustainability? Do you, at any cost? Do you look at subsidy? How do you measure convenience, for example, with bikes? Safety, hours saved, desire of the guys, people that want to buy. I heard in this, somebody mentioned Abu Dhabi, which would be carbon footprint. I've heard very much about that. At what cost? There's no question that they can do it, but it doesn't make any sense other than politically. Dr. Burns, you mentioned about urban mobility. I liked what you said at the end about market, but when you're talking about urban mobility and all those cars and cutting up the curbs into New York and so forth, I have no idea. It didn't mention cost there, or whether people would buy it. Yes, Ms. Krevlin, you talked about leads. I have built a museum. Naturally, the people who wanted the museum wanted platinum. They were shocked when I told them, tell me what's the cost to make platinum. Why is this?
So let's ask, the cost is the elephant in the room, or the price tag is the elephant in the room. We thank you for putting it right here. And why don't we have, I'm mindful of the fact that we have a few minutes left. I want to see if there's a question in this table. So let's have 1 minute on costs, which is not to say that we'll resolve it, but one of you guys have got to get together, and because then I also have a couple of minutes of things to say at the end. Let's talk about cost. Who wants to grab the elephant?
You're going to start.
So
Sartaz.
With technology, I mean, one of the things that we've said is that it'll only come into solution if it's close to being competitive, and then subsidies and policies can push it over. We don't believe that it'll come into solution if there's a huge gap in sort of the new technology being competitive with the existing technology. First of all, there's the issue of cost, but it also has to match the performance of the existing technology. So our view is, yes, if a technology is close to being as good or better as the existing technology, and there's a small cost differential, then subsidies and policy can bring it into solution. So it's the whole valley argument.
It's the whole thing. Mm-hmm.
If it's close to the bottom of the valley, yes, subsidies can work. Not if it's right at the edge.
As I led research for General Motors and people would propose projects, one of the first things we would do is ask ourselves, at a mature scale, high volume, mature technology, will it be cost competitive? In essence, will that pile of molecules cost more than the pile of molecules that we are using today for our solution? And if it didn't pass that first test, we wouldn't go down that path. The challenge we have, especially in my industry, was this 120-year-old automobile design that has enormous inertia behind it, with codependence on 170,000 gasoline stations and 4 million miles of road. That's what we're competing against with new ideas. So We believe these new solutions can be cost competitive, in fact, add more value rather than it being viewed as a trade-off. This word "or" drives me nuts. We shouldn't have to pick between this or this. It should be "and." And when you look at the word "and" the power of this word "and," where we look at all of these opportunities together and pull it together and get off of the trade-off mindset and into the synergy mindset, I think we can deliver these solutions at higher value and lower cost.
Joan, can we get a platinum building at a tin price?
No. And I think that, and nor do you need to. And I think that the point is sort of trying to figure out what your goals are, and kind of, and I think lead can be a distraction. So we're going to put lead aside for a second and just talk about, sustainable decisions are often just smart decisions, and they often don't, the vast majority of them don't necessarily have a cost impact if you're looking at building orientation or how you, build an envelope or where you put your fenestration, how you make material choices. There are places, particularly when you start to do the layer in of higher technology solutions, that there is a cost premium. And at that point, you really have to do a life cycle analysis and see whether the payback makes sense or whether there's other goals, for the institution, whether it's, as a sort of demonstration project or a long-term payback that makes sense. But I do think that we can't get distracted by the high-tech, expensive solutions and really look at basic good decisions that don't really have a cost impact. And then there's that whole collection that do, and they have to be evaluated very carefully.
It's one of the interesting things. There are some policy questions here, because of course there are costs that aren't borne by people who, their externalities and so on and so forth, and also there are hidden subsidies. As we were saying at lunch, Ford, GM, and Toyota, and Shell, and ExxonMobil, and so on and so forth haven't paid for those roads. We have. And it's a choice we made as a society, and we could have chosen other things, but there's actually a hidden subsidy there that we've sort of have forgotten about, and you talk, all that infrastructure, and we could choose to do it differently, in which case the cost equation might be different. But we have made the choice that we've got. We have a question here, and then we're going to have to wrap it up because we did promise people. I want to give everybody here a chance for a 1-minute final word too. Yeah.
Jessica Kirk from Gerson Lerner Group. My question is for Mr. Burns. As I think about this model with this individual 1 or 2 people in the unit, a couple questions came to mind for me. I understand that in some cultures, when they board a bus, they all sit next to each other. And in the US, when people board a bus, they have this amazing geographical dispersity that sort of self-corrects as people continue to board the bus. And I wonder what you think of the societal implications, in what cultures being individual units scooting around works, in what cultures women are often carrying and bringing 3 or 5 children along with them. What is this sort of cultural implications and how that fits in the places these cities are developing? Obviously, we're not going to retrofit New York probably in the next couple of years to do that vision. Where do you think it fits, and what are those cultural implications?
I want to quarrel with your premise. I mean, in a New York City bus, people stand right in a clot right in front of where I try to get to the back of the bus. Isn't that?
Yeah, I think
so, Larry,
it's a fascinating cultural question. People move around and interact, and we're social by nature, and we like to be with the people we want to be with. I've spent a lifetime observing how people do that. I go to subway stations and we watch people who are complete strangers walking by each other all the time, and they're really not interacting. They're not even saying hello, but they're bobbing and weaving and missing each other in a crowd. And your observation on buses, the technology we're talking about, I could have 2 of those vehicles. My wife and I and my 2 children could travel as a family because one of them can follow the other one perfectly. I could be steering the front one, and the electrical impulses I'm putting into the wheels are the same ones that are being put into the wheels on the one behind us. What's very, very interesting about this machine, a transit bus is 64 people, 2 rows of 32 people, 16 seats on each side. So 32 of these machines have the capacity of a bus. 32 of those machines weigh less than the bus, and 32 of those machines cost less than the bus. And what if they were shared machines in the city? And it's really this, how are we interacting today? Are we interacting with the stranger on the bus, or are we interacting with our social network? And what's going on with social networking, the reason my kids would rather have their iPhone than their car is their social network is so important to them. But Joan made the statement earlier, we have to play to the local circumstances. I don't think this is about trying to change someone's culture to fit a technology solution. I think you have to play to that local circumstance for sure.
And I imagine that you could get connecting doors if you had to you know, with these things, we're sort of like hotel rooms, right? You could probably set things up so that you could have a family of 4 in the station wagon. You could have the equivalent of a station wagon that you could put together like so many Lego blocks with something like this if you needed to have. I suppose that could work. All right, we've got 5 minutes left. I'm going to give 3 minutes to each of you, and I'm going to reserve the last 2 minutes for myself, except for 20 seconds for Devin. So 1 minute each. I would like you to sort of think, as you listen to the conversation here, what is one lesson that you want the audience to take, or one idea that you want the audience to take that can actually, you think, move the needle on some of these issues of sustainability in cities and sustainable societies? Sartaz?
I think there's a tremendous opportunity to do things differently. And the moment is now. The technology is out there. It's a question of having the vision to do so.
I'll add to that vision a collective will. And we're going to have to find a way to get everybody on the same page and the same blueprint and move forward as quickly as possible. Learn and make sure that what we learn meets what consumers want and allows people to make some money along the way.
John?
I'm going to remember 10 years ago when my daughter was in 6th grade and she had a science teacher who connected them to environmental issues. And she had us all marching around City Hall holding signs that said, use less stuff. And that phrase, use less stuff, with all the kind of sophisticated talk we look about sustainability, always rings very true to me, that they kind of had it right as young 6th graders.
I heard a couple of things that I think were pretty significant. One, as the twig is bent, so the tree is inclined. Buildings last for a long time. City design lasts for a long time. I mean, you know, and decisions we make now will be decisions, the consequences of which we will live with or perish by in the years to come. I was really reminded, Larry, looking at the stuff you had in Shanghai, of the Futurama exhibit and the Magic Highways exhibits from the 1930s, in which an auto-centric urban paradise was imagined that we realize has turned into something quite different than what was portrayed 70 years ago or so. And to reach that newly radiant city is something that we have an opportunity to do, but we've imagined that before, and we really need to make choices now that are important choices. Secondly, it's a systems problem. You know, we've talked about pieces of the system, but there are other pieces of the system that are represented in this room, but not represented in this room. I mean, IT is not represented in this room, for example, and ought to be. You know, there's even fewer BTUs used in a trip that you don't make, because you have telecommuted or been able to do things like this. And so health and safety systems and all kinds of systems, when we think about sustainable societies, we're not just thinking about sustainability in terms of carbon, but also health and safety and various other things. So there's a whole system thing in there, and other pieces need to come together. And finally, I love the phrase that Joan used about the aesthetics of sustainability. And that is really important. I mean, you know, if you think about, we were talking at lunch today about, you know, we talk about our addiction to oil. Well, you know, if you think about the other and much more difficult addiction to shake, the addiction to tobacco, you know, something happened in the aesthetics of tobacco, in the pricing signals that were sent to kids, in the regulatory systems, and in whether tobacco was cool or not cool. And, you know, the system changed. You know, even in France and in, you know, I mean, and in Italy, the system. There are a few benighted places left, but you know, but it really is remarkable how in a very short period of time, something that people you know would have thought impossible changed. So the impossible is possible if the system lines up in the right kind of way. You know, sustainability is, you know, living well today in such a way that we're not subtracting from the ability to live well tomorrow. And if we can get the thing moving in the right direction, we can indeed get there. So with that, Devin, I'd like to hand it over to you, but I'd also like to thank the audience very much for their participation, and particularly thank the panel.
Absolutely.